The taxi slowed, tires crunching on the meticulously raked gravel drive. Darius pressed his forehead against the cool glass, the manicured lawns of the Cambridge Institute of Technology blurring into a sea of emerald green. A knot tightened in his stomach. This was it. A world away from the dusty red clay of Georgia. A world he'd only glimpsed through the grainy pixels of his scholarship application portal. "Here you go, young man," the driver announced, his voice cutting through Darius's swirling thoughts. Darius fumbled with his worn wallet, the crisp new bills inside a stark contrast to the well-worn leather. He paid, a quiet thank you barely escaping his lips, and stepped onto the hallowed ground. He watched the taxi disappear down the drive, a tangible link to the familiar severing with every meter. He was truly alone now, adrift in this ocean of privilege. He inhaled deeply, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something indefinable, perhaps the very essence of ambition. The weight of his battered suitcase digging into his palm was a grounding presence, a reminder of the journey that had led him here. He adjusted his grip, his calloused fingers brushing against the worn handle, a silent testament to the countless hours he'd spent poring over textbooks, sacrificing everything for this chance. He scanned the faces around him, a kaleidoscope of confident smiles and effortless elegance. Their voices, clipped and assured, drifted towards him, a foreign language he was yet to decipher. He clutched his acceptance letter, the crisp paper a shield against the rising tide of self-doubt. He belonged here. He had earned his place. But the thought felt brittle, fragile, like a thin sheet of ice threatening to crack under the weight of his insecurities. The towering Gothic architecture of the Institute loomed over him, an imposing symbol of centuries of academic excellence. He ran a hand through his close-cropped hair, a nervous habit he couldn't seem to shake. He felt a strange disconnect, as if he were observing himself in a dream, his movements detached and unreal. He was an anomaly here, a scholarship student amongst the scions of wealth and influence. He could feel their curious glances, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Was he worthy? Did he truly belong? The questions echoed the whispers of doubt that had plagued him since he received his acceptance letter, a constant hum beneath the surface of his excitement. He navigated the maze of cobblestone paths, each turn revealing another postcard-perfect vista. He saw groups huddled together, their laughter echoing through the crisp air, a stark contrast to the solitary figure he cut. He envied their easy camaraderie, their innate sense of belonging. He longed to be part of that world, to shed the cloak of his outsider status and embrace the sense of community that seemed to permeate every corner of this hallowed institution. He pushed those thoughts aside, reminding himself of his purpose. He was here to learn, to excel, to prove to himself, and perhaps to the world, that he deserved to be here. He finally reached the dormitory, a more modern structure juxtaposed against the ancient grandeur of the main buildings. He stepped inside, the cool air conditioning a welcome reprieve from the crisp autumn air. The lobby was sparsely furnished, but the clean lines and minimalist decor exuded a quiet sophistication. He approached the reception desk, his heart pounding against his ribs. The receptionist, a young woman with impeccably styled hair and a professional smile, greeted him warmly. "Name?" she inquired, her voice smooth and polished. "Darius Cole," he replied, his voice betraying a hint of the nervousness he was desperately trying to suppress. She checked her list, her eyes scanning the neatly typed names. "Room 304, she announced, handing him a key card. "Third floor on your left." He thanked her, his voice barely a whisper, and turned towards the elevators, the key card clutched tightly in his hand. As he ascended, the quiet hum of the elevator seemed to amplify the silence within him. He closed his eyes, picturing his small, cluttered room back home, a world away from the pristine environment he now found himself in. He wondered if he would ever truly feel at home here, if he would ever bridge the chasm that separated him from the privileged world he had entered. He stepped out of the elevator and walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. He located room 304 and swiped the key card, the soft click of the lock a small victory in the daunting landscape of his new reality. He pushed the door open, stepping into a small but well-appointed room. A single bed, a desk, a chair, and a built-in wardrobe, everything he needed, and nothing more. He set his suitcase down, the thud against the carpeted floor, a punctuation mark to the end of his journey. He was here. He was finally here. But the sense of accomplishment was tinged with a persistent unease, a premonition that his journey was far from over. This was just the beginning. The stale air of the dorm lobby, thick with the scent of disinfectant and old carpet, clung to Darius like a second skin. He shifted the weight of his duffel bag, the worn canvas strap digging into his shoulder. Around him, the buzz of arriving students, their voices echoing off the high ceilings, created a disorienting symphony of greetings and nervous laughter. He felt a prickle of unease, the familiar tightening in his chest that always accompanied new beginnings. Here I am, he thought, at the Cambridge Institute of Technology, a scholarship kid from rural Georgia amongst the brightest minds in the world. The weight of expectation pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He'd imagined this moment countless times, envisioned the grand entrance, the effortless confidence. But now, standing amidst the polished floors and intimidating portraits of past scholars, he felt acutely aware of his worn jeans and faded t-shirt. They probably all came in chauffeured cars. A cynical voice whispered in his head. He pushed the thought away, reminding himself of the grueling hours he'd poured into his studies, the sacrifices he'd made to earn this opportunity. He wouldn't let self-doubt cripple him before he even began. After a brief, impersonal exchange with the receptionist, Darius received his room key, a small, metallic rectangle that felt strangely heavy in his palm. Room 304, Building C. He traced the numbers with his thumb, the cool metal grounding him slightly. He found his building easily enough, a gray brick structure that seemed to exude an air of quiet intellectual intensity. The climb to the third floor felt interminable, each step amplifying the nervous flutter in his stomach. What if my roommate is some kind of prodigy? What if I can't keep up? The doubt swirled, threatening to consume him. He finally reached room 304, pausing for a moment before inserting the key. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the unknown, and pushed the door open. The room was small, sparsely furnished with 2 single beds, 2 desks, and a shared wardrobe. One side of the room was already occupied, clothes strewn across the bed and textbooks stacked haphazardly on the desk. A figure was hunched over the desk, headphones on, seemingly oblivious to Darius's arrival. Darius hesitated, unsure whether to announce himself or simply wait. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic tap of fingers on a keyboard. He looks engrossed, Darius thought, probably solving some complex equation while I'm still trying to catch my breath. He cleared his throat softly. The figure at the desk startled, pulling off his headphones and turning around. He was tall, with a mop of unruly brown hair and kind eyes that held a hint of amusement. "Yo, you Darius?" he asked, his voice a friendly baritone. "Yeah," Darius replied, a knot of tension loosening in his chest. "I'm Darius. And you are?" "Evan. I'm your roommate." He grinned, extending a hand. Darius shook it, surprised by the firmness of his grip. "You in the math track, too?" "Yeah," Darius confirmed, a flicker of hope igniting within him. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. "Nice," Evan said, his smile widening. "This program is brutal, man." Darius felt a pang of apprehension, the earlier anxiety resurfacing. Brutal. He'd heard whispers, rumors of the program's demanding workload and the ruthless competition. He dismissed them as exaggerations, fueled by the anxieties of prospective students. But hearing it from someone already in the program, it was unsettling. He swallowed, forcing a casual smile. "So I've heard." Evan chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Heard is an understatement. Alden, the program head, is intense. He'll chew you up, and spit you out if you're not on top of your game. He paused, studying Darius with a thoughtful expression. But hey, he continued, his tone softening, at least we're in this together, right? Something in Evan's words, the easy camaraderie, the shared understanding of the challenge ahead, resonated deeply within Darius. He felt a genuine connection, a sense of solidarity in the face of a daunting task. The oppressive weight on his chest seemed to lift slightly. Underscore he's right, underscore Darius thought. Underscore we're in this together. Underscore he returned Evan's smile, a genuine one this time. Maybe, just maybe, he could navigate this cutthroat academic world. He had his intelligence, his determination, and now, unexpectedly, a friend. The prospect, though still daunting, no longer seemed quite so terrifying. He set his duffel bag down, the thud against the floor echoing the quiet thud of his anxieties settling within him. He was here. He was ready. And he wasn't alone. He looked around the small, sparsely furnished room, a flicker of anticipation, a spark of resolve igniting within him. This was his new reality, his new battlefield, and he was prepared to fight for his place. The afternoon sunlight, filtered through the dusty window pane, cast long shadows across the room. Darius unpacked his meager belongings, meticulously arranging his books on the desk, each textbook a testament to his hard work and dedication. He glanced at Evan, who was now immersed in a coding problem, his brow furrowed in concentration. The rhythmic tapping of his fingers on the keyboard filled the silence, a comforting counterpoint to Darius's own racing thoughts. Underscore he seems unfazed. Underscore Darius mused. Underscore almost relaxed. Underscore he wondered if Evan was truly as confident as he appeared, or if it was a carefully constructed facade, a shield against the pressure cooker environment they were both entering. He couldn't tell, but the quiet camaraderie, the unspoken understanding of their shared predicament, was a balm to his frayed nerves. He had a feeling that this unlikely friendship, forged in the crucible of the Cambridge Institute of Technology, would be more valuable than any textbook or lecture. He looked at the books on his desk, the symbols and equations of familiar comfort, a language he understood. He felt a surge of determination, a quiet confidence taking root. He was ready for whatever Alden, or Cambridge, threw his way. The mahogany desk, polished to a gleam that reflected the low-hung chandelier, seemed to amplify the silence of Professor Alden's office. Outside, the Gothic spires of Cambridge etched themselves against the bruised twilight sky. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old books and something faintly metallic, like the ghost of a recent rain. Alden's fingers, long and pale, traced the lines of the student roster. Each name represented a carefully curated piece of the Cambridge Institute of Technology's prestigious mathematics enrichment program, a program he had meticulously built, brick by brilliant brick, over the past 15 years. His gaze snagged on a particular entry. Cole, Darius from Georgia, he murmured, the sound barely audible above the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. The name itself wasn't unusual. It was the accompanying annotation, full scholarship, coupled with the stated origin that piqued his interest, a faint prickle of unease tugging at the edges of his composure. Georgia. He couldn't quite place why, but the name of the state seemed incongruous with the polished, almost predictable brilliance he expected from his students. The image of Darius Cole flickered in his mind, a fleeting memory from the orientation, a young man with quiet eyes and a hesitant smile, almost swallowed by the grandeur of the hall. Alden recalled a distinct lack of the usual self-assured aura that surrounded the other prodigies. Had he even spoken? Alden couldn't remember. A ripple of something he wouldn't quite name suspicion, perhaps, or even a sliver of resentment passed through him. He tapped the roster with a pen, the sound sharp in the stillness. Could a student from a relatively unknown background truly possess the intellectual firepower to thrive in this environment? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Alden found himself staring at the name again, as if searching for some hidden clue, some indication of a mistake, a clerical error that would neatly justify his unease. But there was none. Just the name Darius Cole, a quiet challenge to the established order of things. Later that night, The muted glow of the desk lamp painted long shadows across Darius's dorm room. The Cambridge air, seeped with centuries of academic rigor, felt both exhilarating and suffocating. He sat hunched over a textbook, the complex equations swimming before his eyes, a blur of Greek symbols and mathematical notations. His mind, however, wasn't on the problem in front of him. It was caught in the labyrinthine corridors of self-doubt. Had he made a mistake coming here? Did he truly belong among these intellectual giants, these students who seemed to effortlessly grasp concepts that took him hours of painstaking study to comprehend? A wave of exhaustion washed over him. He pushed the book aside, the sudden movement sending a stack of papers fluttering to the floor. The small, familiar sound amplified the silence of the room, a silence that resonated with the unspoken anxieties that crowded his thoughts. A soft chime broke the stillness. He picked up his phone, his heart giving a small, involuntary leap. It was a text from his mother. "Just thinking of you, son. Remember what I always told you? You're stronger than you think. Love you lots." He reread the message, the simple words a balm to his frayed nerves. His mother's unwavering belief in him, even when he doubted himself, had always been his anchor. A faint smile touched his lips. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of her words seep into the cold, hard reality of his present situation. He was here, at Cambridge, against all odds, and he wasn't about to give up. He thought back to the scholarship interview, the panel of stern-faced professors grilling him on complex mathematical theories, their expressions scrutinizing, almost dissecting, his every response. He'd felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest, the pressure threatening to crush him. But somewhere deep inside, a flicker of defiance had ignited. He had answered their questions with a quiet confidence, a certainty that stemmed not from arrogance, but from years of dedicated study, of burning the midnight oil in his small-town Georgia library, driven by a hunger to learn, to understand the intricate language of the universe written in numbers and symbols. The memory fueled a resurgence of determination. He picked up his textbook again, the equations no longer a blur, but a challenge, an invitation to explore the hidden patterns, the elegant logic that underpin the universe. He knew he had to work harder than anyone else, had to prove himself worthy of the opportunity that had been given to him. He wasn't just representing himself. He was carrying the hopes and dreams of his family, of his small community back in Georgia. He was a testament to the power of perseverance, of the belief that brilliance could bloom anywhere, even in the most unlikely of places. The image of Professor Alden's face flashed briefly in his mind, the subtle skepticism he had sensed in the older man's gaze during the orientation. Darius couldn't shake the feeling that Alden was watching him, evaluating him, waiting for him to falter. The thought sparked a flicker of unease, a premonition of a future confrontation. He pushed it aside, refusing to let it derail his focus. He had faced challenges before, had overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. He would face this one too. He would prove himself, not just to Alden, not just to Cambridge, but to himself. He would conquer this world of numbers, this realm of abstract thought, and he would do it with the quiet strength and unwavering determination that had brought him this far. He opened his textbook, his gaze fixed on the complex equations, a quiet fire burning in his eyes. The night was long, but he was ready. The fluorescent lights of the lecture hall hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the nervous flutter in Darius's chest. Rows of polished wood desks stretched before him, each occupied by a student radiating an almost tangible aura of intellectual intensity. He inhaled, the scent of chalk dust and old paper oddly comforting. "Don't let them intimidate you," he told himself, his fingers tracing the worn edges of his notebook. "You earned your place here." Yet the sheer weight of the room, the collective intellect it contained, pressed down on him like a physical burden. He'd seen pictures, of course, but the reality of the Cambridge Institute of Technology was a different beast entirely. This wasn't the modest brick building of Georgia State. This was hallowed ground, where the air itself seemed to crackle with equations and theorems. Professor Alden entered, his presence commanding an immediate silence. Tall and gaunt, with a hawk-like nose and eyes that seemed to dissect everything they landed on, he moved with an almost predatory grace. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. With a curt nod, he launched into a complex discussion of theoretical applications, his voice sharp and precise, each word a carefully aimed dart. Darius struggled to keep up, his pen scribbling furiously across the page, the symbols blurring into a frantic dance. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, assessing, judging. They probably think I'm lost, he thought, a familiar wave of self-doubt washing over him. That I'm not good enough. He pushed the thought away, forcing himself to focus on the intricate web of equations unfolding on the chalkboard. An hour bled into the next, the lecture a relentless torrent of information. Alden paused, fixing his gaze on a student in the front row. "Mr. Davies," he said, his voice laced with a chilling politeness. "Perhaps you can enlighten us as to the practical application of the Riemann hypothesis in quantum computing?" Davies stammered, his face flushing crimson under the professor's unwavering stare. He mumbled an incoherent response, the words dissolving into a desperate plea for mercy. Alden's lips curled into a thin smile. "Disappointing, Mr. Davies. Utterly disappointing." The air in the room thickened, the weight of Alden's disapproval settling like a shroud. Darius felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He enjoys this, he realized, a cold shiver running down his spine. He enjoys breaking them down. The lecture continued, the incident with Davies hanging in the air like a warning. Darius's mind raced, trying to anticipate Alden's next move, to prepare himself for the inevitable interrogation. He felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would be next. He had to prove himself, not just to Alden, but to himself. When the class finally ended, Darius felt drained, the mental exertion leaving him lightheaded. He gathered his things, his hands trembling slightly. As he turned to leave, he heard Alden's voice, sharp and clear, cutting through the murmuring of the other students. "Cole!" Darius froze, his heart pounding against his ribs. He turned slowly, facing the professor. Alden's eyes, cold and calculating, bored into him. "You're Cole, right?" From Georgia, Alden's voice trailed off, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. "Yes, sir," Darius replied, his voice steadier than he expected. He met Alden's gaze, refusing to flinch. "Don't show weakness," he told himself, his grip tightening on his notebook. "Don't let him see you sweat." Alden's eyes narrowed. You're the scholarship student." The words were simple, almost innocuous, yet they carried a weight of unspoken assumptions, of preconceived notions. Darius felt a flicker of anger, a spark of defiance igniting within him. He recognized the subtle dismissal, the implication that his presence here was a charity, not a testament to his abilities. "Yes, sir," Darius repeated, his voice now edged with steel. He refused to elaborate, to justify his presence in this hallowed hall. His silence was a challenge, a subtle rebellion against the unspoken accusations. Alden studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Darius held his ground, his heart pounding a steady rhythm against his ribs. He could feel the weight of Alden's gaze, the unspoken questions swirling in the air between them. "What are you looking for, Professor?" He wondered, his mind racing. "What are you trying to find?" A ghost of a smile played on Alden's lips. "Very well, Mr. Cole," he said, his voice smooth, almost gentle. "Let's see what you're made of." He turned and walked away, leaving Darius standing alone in the emptying lecture hall, the weight of his words settling upon him like a prophecy. The fluorescent lights hummed, their sterile glow reflecting off the polished wood desks, each one a silent witness to the unspoken battle that had just begun. Darius took a deep breath, the scent of chalk dust and old paper now tinged with a faint metallic tang of anticipation. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was just the beginning. The real test was yet to come, and he was ready. The muted hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the small dorm room, a low counterpoint to the rhythmic tapping of Evan's pen against his textbook. Darius sat hunched over his own notes, the dense symbols of advanced calculus swirling before his eyes, yet his mind remained stubbornly fixed on the previous day's lecture. Professor Alden's voice, crisp and edged with an almost imperceptible disdain, echoed in his memory. He could still feel the sting of the man's gaze, sharp and dissecting, lingering on him just a fraction longer than on the other students. "You know," Evans said, breaking the silence, "Alden's got it out for someone. I just can't figure out who." He stretched, his joints popping softly. "Maybe it's the entire freshman class. A sort of hazing ritual." Darius lifted his head, a wry smile twitching at the corner of his lips. He doubted it was hazing. He suspected it was something else, something colder, more calculated. He'd seen that look before, back in Georgia, in the eyes of those who dismissed him, the scholarship kid from the wrong side of town. He pushed the thought away, a familiar ache settling in his chest. "Maybe he just enjoys the intellectual sparring," Darius offered, his voice carefully neutral. Evan snorted. "Sparring? It's more like a public execution. Did you see how he dismantled poor Emily's proof yesterday? Absolutely brutal." He shuddered dramatically. Darius nodded, remembering the incident vividly. Emily, usually so confident, had shrunk under Alden's relentless questioning, her voice barely a whisper. He could almost taste the metallic tang of fear in the air, the same fear that now tightened its grip around his own stomach. He forced himself to focus on the equations in front of him, seeking refuge in their predictable logic. He needed to prove himself, not just to Alden, but to himself, to silence the nagging voice of doubt that whispered he didn't belong here amidst the hallowed halls of the Cambridge Institute of Technology. Days later, the air in Alden's classroom crackled with anticipation, the unsettling quiet before a storm. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the rows of desks. But the brightness couldn't dispel the palpable tension that hung in the air. A pop quiz. 2 words that could send a shiver down the spine of even the most seasoned student. Alden paced before them, his expression unreadable, a stack of papers clutched in his hand. He distributed the sheets with a practiced flick of the wrist, the crisp sound echoing in the strained silence. Darius stared down at the single, complex equation. It looked wrong. He reread it, his brow furrowing. The premise itself was flawed. A subtle error, easily missed, but an error nonetheless. A flicker of something akin to anger, quickly followed by a strange sense of exhilaration, coursed through him. He felt a pull, a challenge he couldn't resist. He began to rewrite the problem, meticulously correcting the flaw, his pen moving with a swift, almost frantic energy. He knew the risk he was taking, challenging Alden's authority, but the need to solve the puzzle, to prove the elegance of correct mathematics, overrode any fear of repercussions. As he finished, a strange calm settled over him. He handed in his paper, his heart pounding against his ribs, a curious mixture of trepidation and defiance swirling within him. He met Alden's gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in the professor's eyes. The following lecture was a blur. Darius couldn't focus, his mind replaying the events of the quiz, dissecting every detail, every nuance of Alden's expression. He felt a strange disconnect, as if he were observing the scene from a distance. Later that day, Alden summoned Darius to his office. The room was dimly lit, the heavy oak furniture casting long shadows. Alden sat behind his large desk, the quiz paper in his hand. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "You rewrote the problem?" Alden asked, his voice low, laced with a hint of surprise. He looked up at Darius, his gaze intense, searching. Darius's mind raced. He'd anticipated anger, perhaps even ridicule. But this was different. He saw a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher in Alden's eyes. Was it curiosity, respect, or something else entirely? "Yes, sir," Darius replied, his voice steady, despite the tremor of anxiety that ran through him. The original premise contained a logical inconsistency. It wasn't solvable as presented. Alden leaned back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. And you felt the need to correct it? Darius hesitated, searching for the right words. Two couldn't solve a problem that was inherently flawed. It felt disrespectful to the mathematics itself. He watched as Alden's expression shifted, a complex interplay of emotions flitting across his face. The silence hung heavy in the air, charged with an unspoken tension. Darius's heart hammered against his ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation. He had crossed the line, challenged the established order. He braced himself for the inevitable reprimand, but never came. The stale scent of chalk dust mingled with the faint metallic tang of overused radiators, a familiar perfume in the hallowed halls of the Cambridge Institute of Technology. Darius traced the grain of the worn wooden desk with his fingertip, the rhythmic rasp a counterpoint to the frantic drumbeat of his own pulse. Days had bled into one another since his initial encounter with Professor Alden, each lecture a meticulously crafted performance, each problem set a silent duel. He watched as the other students filed into the classroom, a mix of nervous energy and forced nonchalance clinging to them like a second skin. Evan slid into the seat beside him, a wry smile playing on his lips. Ready for another round in the Alden arena, he murmured, his voice barely audible above the settling murmur of the class. Darius offered a tight-lipped smile in return. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew he couldn't afford not to be. The pressure, the subtle disdain in Alden's gaze, the constant feeling of being scrutinized, it had all coalesced into a simmering resentment, a quiet defiance that gnawed at his composure. Alden entered the room, his presence immediately commanding attention. The casual chatter died down, replaced by the rustle of notebooks and the click of pens. He surveyed the class, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second longer on Darius, a subtle flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Darius felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This scrutiny, this unspoken challenge, it was more than just academic rigor. It felt personal, a test not just of his intellectual capabilities, but of his very right to be here in this hallowed institution. He shifted in his seat, the stiff wooden chair digging into his back, a physical manifestation of the discomfort that gnawed at him. Today, Alden began, his voice smooth, controlled. We will deviate from our usual routine. A ripple of anticipation, tinged with apprehension, ran through the room. Darius straightened, his attention sharpening. He sensed a trap being laid, a carefully constructed scenario designed to expose weakness. I've prepared a particularly challenging problem, Alden continued, a glint of something akin to amusement in his eyes. The first student to solve it correctly will receive a significant advantage. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. I will drop your lowest quiz score for the semester. A collective intake of breath. The stakes had just been raised. Darius felt a surge of something cold and hard in his chest. It wasn't ambition, not the usual competitive drive that propelled him. It was something darker, a refusal to be manipulated, a need to dismantle the subtle power play Alden had orchestrated. The reward, the drop quiz score, felt insignificant in comparison to the burning need to prove himself, not to Alden, not to the institution, but to himself. He knew he wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. He could sense the anxiety radiating from his classmates, the silent calculations, the desperate yearning for validation. But for Darius, this wasn't just about a grade. It was about reclaiming his own narrative, about refusing to be defined by the expectations of others. Alden wrote the problem on the board, a complex equation filled with Greek symbols and abstract notations. The silence in the room deepened, broken only by the scratching of pens as students began their frantic calculations. Darius stared at the equation, his mind a whirlwind of numbers and symbols. He could almost hear Alden's unspoken challenge echoing in his ears, a subtle taunt designed to break his concentration. But instead of crumbling under the pressure, Darius felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. This was his domain, his sanctuary. Numbers weren't just abstract symbols. They were a language, a world he understood intimately. He began to work, his pen moving across the paper with a steady rhythm. He wasn't conscious of the time passing, of the strained silence in the room, of the curious glances thrown his way. He was lost in the intricate dance of numbers, the elegant logic of the equation unfolding before him. He felt a flicker of something akin to excitement, the thrill of the chase, the anticipation of the solution. Evan leaned closer, his voice a hushed whisper. "You going for it, Darius?" The question wasn't about the problem, not really. It was about the unspoken challenge, the silent battle of wills being waged between Darius and Alden. Darius didn't answer verbally. He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the equation. His silence wasn't a sign of hesitation, but of resolve. He wasn't doing this for the reward, for the drop quiz score. He was doing it to prove a point, to challenge the assumptions, the subtle prejudices that seemed to cling to him like a shadow. He was doing it for himself. He finished his calculations, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. He raised his hand, the movement deliberate, almost defiant. Alden's gaze snapped towards him, a mixture of surprise and something that looked remarkably like respect. Darius couldn't be sure. All he knew was that he had solved the problem, not just mathematically, but personally. He had faced the challenge, the pressure, the unspoken doubts, and he had emerged victorious. He had claimed his space, his right to be here, in this arena of intellect and ambition. And in that moment, the stale air of the classroom, the weight of expectations, the subtle sting of prejudice, it all faded away, replaced by the quiet hum of triumph. The silence in the room stretched, taut with anticipation. The unspoken question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Had he truly solved it? Had this scholarship student, this outsider, truly conquered the challenge set by the gatekeeper of this prestigious institution? Alden's gaze held his, a long, silent assessment, and then a slow, almost reluctant nod. The tension in the room broke, replaced by a collective exhale. Darius lowered his hand. The subtle tremor he hadn't even realized was there now gone. He had proven his point. He belonged. The fluorescent lights of the classroom hummed, a dull counterpoint to the frantic scribbling of pencils on paper. Darius felt the weight of every gaze, the silence amplifying the pressure. Alden's classroom was a theater of intellect, and today, Darius was the main act. He could feel the sweat prickling on his palms, a stark contrast to the icy chill that snaked down his spine. He glanced at the complex equations sprawling across the board, a Gordian knot of symbols and Greek letters. It was Alden's latest challenge, a problem designed to separate the wheat from the chaff. He wants to see me fail, Darius thought, the realization a bitter taste on his tongue. He wants to prove that a scholarship kid from Georgia doesn't belong here. Darius picked up the chalk, its rough texture a small comfort in this crucible of anxieties. He had spent hours dissecting the problem, turning it over and over in his mind, searching for the elusive thread that would unravel its complexities. He knew his approach was unconventional. He could almost feel Alden's disapproval radiating from the front of the room, a palpable force pushing against him. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. The chalk moved across the board, leaving a trail of equations in its wake. Each stroke was deliberate, each step a testament to his relentless preparation. Evan, from the corner of his eye, seemed to hold his breath. Darius could imagine what was going through his roommate's mind, a mixture of awe and anxiety. The classroom was a pressure cooker, and they were both inside, the heat intensifying with each passing second. "Are you sure that's the most efficient approach, Mr. Cole?" Alden's voice cut through the silence, laced with a thinly veiled skepticism. Darius paused, his hand hovering over the board. He's enjoying this, he thought, a surge of anger momentarily eclipsing his anxiety. He wants to see me stumble, to watch me crumble under the pressure. He met Alden's gaze, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "I believe so, Professor," he replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. He returned to the problem, the chalk now a weapon in his hand. He could hear Alden's soft sigh, a sound that grated on his nerves. It was the sound of condescension, of disappointment barely concealed. Darius pushed the feeling down, burying it deep beneath layers of concentration. He couldn't afford to be distracted, not now. He poured all his energy into the equation, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and theorems. He saw the connections that others had missed, the hidden pathways that led to the solution. The silence in the room deepened, broken only by the rhythmic scratching of his chalk. He could feel the weight of expectations, the unspoken doubts hanging heavy in the air. He was not just solving a problem, he was fighting for his place, for the right to be here. He was proving that he belonged, that his scholarship wasn't a charity case, but a recognition of his raw talent. As he neared the final steps, a strange sense of calm washed over him. He was in the zone now, completely absorbed in the intricate dance of numbers and symbols. The world outside the classroom faded away. The pressure, the doubts, the scrutiny, all of it vanished, leaving only the pure, exhilarating pursuit of knowledge. Interesting, Alden's voice, low and laced with a new kind of tension, broke through Darius's concentration. "Let's hope you didn't just back yourself into a corner, Mr. Cole." The words hung in the air, a veiled threat, a challenge. Darius felt a surge of annoyance. He knew Alden was trying to rattle him, to undermine his confidence. But it was too late. He was too close. He continued writing, his hand moving with a newfound speed and precision. The final equation emerged on the board, elegant and undeniable. He turned to face Alden, his heart pounding against his ribs. A long silence descended upon the classroom. Alden stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the board. The expression on his face was unreadable, a mixture of surprise and something else, something that Darius couldn't quite decipher. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension. The other students shifted uneasily in their seats, their whispers barely audible. Evan's eyes were wide, reflecting the astonishment that filled the room. Darius felt a slow, steady surge of satisfaction. He had done it. He had solved the problem, not just correctly, but with an elegance and efficiency that even Alden hadn't anticipated. He had met the challenge head-on and emerged victorious. He hadn't just proven his mathematical prowess. He had asserted his presence, his right to be in this hallowed hall of academia. The subtle shift in the atmosphere was palpable. It was as if the very air in the room had changed, charged with a new energy. The doubt and skepticism that had hung so heavily just moments ago had dissipated, replaced by a grudging respect. Darius could feel Alden's gaze on him, no longer laced with skepticism, but with something akin to, was it admiration? He couldn't be sure. He held Alden's gaze, his own eyes unwavering. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. He knew that this was just the beginning. The chill of the Cambridge air seeped into Darius's bones, a stark contrast to the feverish heat that had ballooned his chest just moments ago in the stuffy lecture hall. Around him, the whispers had changed. No longer were they laced with doubt, with that subtle disdain he'd become accustomed to since arriving at the Institute. Now a different kind of murmur rippled through the dispersing students, something akin to awe, perhaps even a touch of fear. He could feel their gazes, not directly on him, but skirting around him, as if he were a newly discovered celestial body, radiating an unfamiliar energy. Darius tucked his chin, a familiar gesture of self-preservation against the weight of their attention. He had dismantled Professor Alden's problem with a swiftness that bordered on insolence, a solution so elegant it had left the renowned mathematician speechless. A small, bitter triumph coiled in his gut. He had wanted this recognition, this proof of his ability. Yet, the victory felt hollow, tainted by the unsettling stillness in Alden's eyes as he'd watched Darius write the final equation on the board. Evan clapped him on the shoulder, a grin splitting his face. "Mate, you absolutely demolished him. Did you see his face? Priceless." Darius managed a weak smile, the anxiety that perpetually simmered beneath his skin refusing to be extinguished. "It was just a problem, Evan. He didn't voice the unease that pricked at him, the premonition that this small victory might come at a steep price. Alden's silence had been more unsettling than any outburst. It was the silence of a predator assessing its prey. The rest of the day passed in a haze of muted congratulations and furtive glances. Darius found himself retreating to the quiet sanctuary of the library, the familiar scent of old paper and ink a balm to his frayed nerves. He tried to focus on his textbooks, the complex equations a welcome distraction, but Alden's unwavering gaze seemed to linger in the periphery of his vision. Doubt gnawed at him. Had he been too arrogant? Had he misread the situation entirely? He was, after all, just a scholarship student from a small town in Georgia, a world away from the polished sophistication of Cambridge. Back in his dorm room, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic tapping of Evan's keyboard. Darius sat on his bed, staring at the email icon on his laptop. He knew there was a message waiting for him. He could feel it like a physical weight in his chest. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the touchpad. He knew, instinctively, that whatever lay within that email wouldn't be good. He took a deep breath, the stale dorm air doing little to calm the rising panic. Click! The subject line hit him like a physical blow. Academic integrity review response required. The blood drained from his face, leaving him cold and clammy. He read the terse, formal language of the email, each word a hammer blow shattering the fragile shell of his confidence. Professor Alden was accusing him of plagiarism, claiming his solution to the problem had been obtained illicitly. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in on him. He reread the email, desperately searching for a loophole, a misunderstanding, anything that could explain this sudden, brutal accusation. His mind raced, a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. He hadn't cheated, he knew he hadn't. The solution had come to him in a flash of inspiration, a moment of pure, unadulterated mathematical clarity. How could he prove that? How could he prove the workings of his own mind? Evan, sensing his distress, swiveled around in his chair. Everything all right, Darius? He saw the stark pallor of Darius's face, the email glaring from the screen. What the Alden's accusing you of cheating? That's insane. Darius could only shake his head, the words caught in his throat. He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a sickening premonition of the battle that lay ahead. He had faced skepticism before, subtle prejudice veiled in polite smiles and condescending questions. But this was different. This was a direct attack, a calculated move to discredit him, to erase him from this hallowed institution. He closed his eyes, drawing a deep, shaky breath. He thought of his grandmother, her unwavering belief in him, the sacrifices she'd made to send him here. He thought of the burning desire that had driven him, the relentless pursuit of knowledge that had brought him this far. He wouldn't let Alden win. He wouldn't let this accusation tarnish everything he'd worked for. A steely resolve hardened his gaze. He would fight. He had to. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every other kid from a small town, every other scholarship student who dared to dream of a place at the table of intellectual giants. He opened his eyes, the fear replaced by a quiet, burning anger. He would prove Alden wrong. He would prove them all wrong. He had to. The silence in the room stretched, heavy with unspoken tension. Evan watched his friend, a mixture of concern and admiration swirling in his eyes. He'd seen Darius's quiet strength before, the unwavering determination that lay beneath his unassuming exterior. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that Darius wouldn't break. Darius took another deep breath, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He would respond to the email. He would face this accusation head-on. He wouldn't let fear paralyze him. He would fight. He had to. The fight had just begun. The fluorescent lights of the Office of Academic Standards hummed a monotonous tune, a stark counterpoint to the frantic rhythm hammering against Darius's ribs. The sterile white walls seemed to close in, amplifying the silence between questions, a silence thick with unspoken accusations. He could smell the faint, metallic tang of the chair's armrest beneath his damp palms, a scent that would forever be associated with this suffocating anxiety. Across the polished table, Professor Alden sat, his face an impassive mask, his gaze sharp and unwavering. Beside him, two other professors from the mathematics department, their expressions a blend of curiosity and suspicion, scrutinized Darius like entomologists examining a rare, potentially dangerous insect. Darius shifted in his seat, the stiff fabric of his trousers rustling against the plastic chair. "They think I cheated," he thought, the words a bitter taste in his mouth. "They think a scholarship kid from Georgia couldn't possibly have solved it on his own." "Mr. Cole," Professor Alden began, his voice smooth, controlled, each word meticulously enunciated, "we are here today to discuss your solution to the Riemann hypothesis problem set. A solution, I might add, that is remarkably similar to one published several years ago in a rather obscure Romanian journal." Alden tapped a finger on the printed copy of Darius's work, the gesture precise, almost theatrical. Darius swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He had poured weeks into that problem set, sacrificing sleep, social interaction, even meals, driven by a burning need to prove himself, to justify the faith the scholarship committee had placed in him. Now, this accusation, this insinuation of plagiarism, hung in the air like a toxic cloud, threatening to suffocate his ambitions. Similar? He thought, his mind racing. Of course, there might be similarities. It's mathematics, not poetry. There are only so many ways to approach a problem. "Professor Alden," Darius began, his voice a little shaky, "I assure you my solution is entirely my own. I haven't even seen the Romanian journal you're referring to." He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of the humming lights. He forced himself to meet Alden's gaze, trying to project an image of calm confidence he didn't feel. Alden raised an eyebrow, a sliver of skepticism in his eyes. "Indeed? Perhaps you could explain then, Mr. Cole, the rather unconventional method you employed in the third stage of your proof." Darius took a deep breath, trying to quell the rising panic. He remembered the late nights spent wrestling with that particular section, the exhilarating rush when he'd finally found the key, the elegant, almost intuitive approach that had unlocked the solution. It was unconventional, yes, but it was his. The standard approach, he explained, his voice gaining strength, would have involved utilizing the Dirichlet L functions. However, I realized that by applying a modified version of the Voronoi summation formula, I could bypass the limitations of the L functions and arrive at a more direct and ultimately more efficient solution. He could see a flicker of something in Alden's eyes, a subtle shift in his expression that he couldn't quite decipher. One of the other professors, a younger woman with kind eyes and a slightly hesitant smile, leaned forward. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice softer than Alden's, "could you elaborate on your application of the Voronoi summation formula? Specifically, how did you account for the error term?" This was it, Darius thought. This was the moment. He walked them through his reasoning, his voice gaining confidence with each equation, each carefully chosen word. He explained his innovative approach to handling the error term, the subtle but crucial adjustment he'd made to the standard formula, the insight that had set his solution apart. As he spoke, he could sense the shift in the room, the gradual thawing of the icy skepticism. The younger professor's smile widened, a genuine expression of understanding and appreciation. Even Alden's impassive mask seemed to crack, revealing a flicker of, was it admiration? The questioning continued for another hour, delving deeper into the intricacies of his proof. Darius answered each question with precision and clarity, his initial anxiety replaced by a quiet confidence. He knew his work was sound, his methods rigorous. He had nothing to hide. Finally, Alden cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the suddenly silent room. "Thank you, Mr. Cole," he said, his voice still formal, but now laced with a hint of something else, something that sounded almost like respect. "That will be all." Darius rose, his legs slightly unsteady after the prolonged interrogation. He nodded to the professors and walked out of the office, the fluorescent hum still buzzing in his ears, but now it seemed less like a threat and more like a background score to his own silent victory. Back in his dorm room, the email arrived. He stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. Review closed. No violation found. The words shimmered, each letter a beacon of validation. He leaned back in his chair, a wave of exhaustion washing over him, followed by a profound sense of relief. He had done it. He had proven himself. He belonged here. Evan, his roommate, walked in, a questioning look on his face. "Well?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Darius looked up, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's over," he said, the words heavy with meaning. "It's finally over." The faint hum of the radiator filled the small dorm room, a comforting counterpoint to the rhythmic tapping of Evan's fingers against his desk. Darius sat on his bed, the worn textbook still open in his lap, but his gaze lost somewhere in the swirling patterns of the faded rug. The adrenaline that had coursed through him during Professor Alden's final, unexpected quiz, a fiendish puzzle wrapped in layers of deceptively simple equations, had finally receded, leaving behind a strange calm. It wasn't just relief. It was a quiet certainty, a sense of solidity he hadn't felt before arriving at the Cambridge Institute of Technology. He could still feel the weight of Alden's gaze during the test, a palpable pressure that had initially threatened to suffocate him. He'd almost succumbed to the familiar anxiety, the insidious whisper of doubt that always seemed to follow him like a shadow, reminding him he was a scholarship student, an outsider in this hallowed hall of academic privilege. He'd seen that flicker of disdain in Alden's eyes, the barely perceptible curl of his lip as he'd handed Darius the paper, the implicit challenge, "Prove you belong." For a moment, the weight of expectation, the fear of failure, had been almost crushing. He'd almost allowed himself to believe, just for a second, that he wasn't good enough. Then something shifted. He'd looked down at the equations, and instead of fear, a spark of excitement ignited within him. The complex symbols, the intricate dance of numbers, it was a language he understood, a world where he felt at home. The anxiety melted away, replaced by a laser-like focus. He'd lost himself in the problem, the world narrowing to the crisp white page and the elegant flow of his pen across its surface. He remembered the subtle shift in Alden's expression as he'd approached a hand in his paper, the surprise masked by a professional composure. He hadn't needed the professor's validation, but the grudging acknowledgement in Alden's eyes was a small, satisfying victory nonetheless. Evan's voice broke through his reverie. "Dude, you beat the setup." He swiveled around in his chair, a grin splitting his face. "Seriously, that last quiz was brutal. Even I couldn't crack it. How'd you do it?" Darius met Evan's gaze, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I'm just getting started." The words hung in the air, charged with a meaning that went beyond the immediate triumph. It wasn't just about the quiz. It was about overcoming the internal and external barriers he'd faced since arriving at Cambridge. The subtle jabs from some of the other students, the whispers about his background, the pressure to prove he wasn't just a token diversity admit. He'd faced them all, absorbed them, and transformed them into fuel. He thought about the sacrifices he'd made, the long hours spent studying under the flickering fluorescent lights of his small-town library back in Georgia, the unwavering support of his family. They believed in him even when he doubted himself, their faith a constant beacon in the darkness. This victory wasn't just his, it was theirs too. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in on a life he was rapidly outgrowing. Cambridge, this bastion of privilege and tradition, had felt like an alien world at first. He'd been intimidated by the grandeur of the buildings, the hushed whispers in the hallowed halls, the air thick with the weight of centuries of academic achievement. He'd felt like an intruder, constantly on the verge of being exposed as a fraud. But now, something had changed. He'd walked through fire and emerged not just unscathed, but stronger. He still felt the heat, but it no longer burned. It warmed him, tempered him. He knew he still had a long way to go. Countless challenges lay ahead, but he was ready. He was more than ready. Evan leaned back in his chair, studying Darius with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said slowly, Alden's not an easy nut to crack. He's got this reputation. He likes to test people, especially the scholarship kids. Darius nodded, the ghost of a smile playing on his lips. He'd sensed that, the unspoken challenge in Alden's gaze, the subtle tests embedded in his seemingly innocuous questions. He's just doing his job, Darius replied, his voice calm and even, making sure we're up to the task. But beneath the calm exterior, a different thought took root. He knew Alden's scrutiny wasn't just about academic rigor. It was about something else, something deeper, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. A need to maintain control, perhaps, or maybe a subconscious bias. A need to reinforce the established order. Whatever it was, Darius understood that his presence here, his success, challenged that order. He looked around the small, cluttered room, the faded posters on the walls, the overflowing bookshelves, the worn rug beneath his feet. It was a world away from the polished mahogany and gleaming marble of the Institute's halls, but it was his world. And now, after facing Alden's scrutiny, after conquering his own doubts, he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't felt before. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. The hum of the radiator filled the silence, a steady, reassuring presence. He closed his eyes, the equations from the quiz replaying in his mind. Each symbol, each number, a testament to his resilience, his intellect, his unwavering belief in himself. He wasn't just a scholarship student anymore. He was a mathematician. And he was just getting started. The rain hammered against the tall windows of the faculty lounge, a relentless rhythm against the hushed interior. Darius could smell the damp wool of his coat, a scent oddly comforting amidst the knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. He'd chosen this time deliberately. Thursday afternoon, a lull before the weekend rush, a moment when Alden might be alone, caught between lectures and looming administrative tasks. The older man sat hunched over a stack of papers, the lamplight catching the silver streaks in his dark hair. Darius hesitated at the threshold, the polished wood floors seeming to amplify the click of his shoes. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to turn and flee, to retreat back to the familiar anonymity of the library stacks. But he'd come this far, propelled by a force stronger than his apprehension. Alden glanced up, his expression unreadable behind thin, wire-rimmed spectacles. "Cole, something I can do for you." His voice was polite, almost detached, but Darius detected a flicker of something else, a guardedness that tightened the coil in his gut. "Professor Alden," Darius began, his voice lower than he intended. He cleared his throat, trying to gather the fragments of his carefully rehearsed speech. "I wanted to understand." Alden set down his pen, the faint scratch of the nib ceasing abruptly. The silence that followed felt thick with unspoken words, a heavy curtain drawn between them. Darius could feel the damp chill seeping through the soles of his shoes, a stark contrast to the burning heat that flushed his cheeks. He wondered if Alden could hear the frantic thump of his heart, a desperate drumbeat against his ribs. "Understand what, Mr. Cole?" Alden's gaze was sharp, dissecting. Darius felt like a specimen under a microscope, every flaw and imperfection laid bare. He shifted his weight, the uneven floorboards groaning beneath his feet. "Your treatment of me, since I joined the program." The words felt clumsy, inadequate to express the subtle but persistent undermining he'd experienced. Alden leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. He steepled his fingers, a gesture Darius had come to associate with carefully concealed impatience. "Treatment? I'm not sure I follow." Darius took a deep breath, the scent of old books and stale coffee filling his lungs. He thought of Evan's words of encouragement, of the quiet confidence in his roommate's eyes. He'd come too far to retreat now. "You've questioned my solutions in front of the class," Darius said, his voice gaining a measure of steadiness. "Challenge my methods, even when they were correct. You've consistently overlooked my contributions to the group projects." He paused, the words hanging in the air between them. "I need to know why." Alden regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The rain continued its relentless assault against the windows, a soundtrack to the tension that filled the room. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "You made me look wrong, Cole." The words hung in the air, stark and unexpected. Darius felt a flicker of disbelief, a ripple of confusion that momentarily dislodged his carefully constructed composure. "Wrong?" he echoed, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. I solve the problems. Isn't that the point of the program?" Alden let out a short, dry laugh. "The point, Mr. Cole, is to maintain a certain standard, a certain image. And you," he paused, his gaze piercing, "you came in here a scholarship student from Georgia and disrupted that image." The unspoken words, the implication of his origins being a mark against him, hung heavy in the air. Darius felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was it, the core of the problem, the unspoken prejudice that had shadowed him since his arrival. "I'm not asking for your approval, Professor Alden," Darius said, his voice unwavering despite the turmoil within. "Just the chance to earn it, like anyone else." Alden's face tightened, the muscles in his jaw working. He seemed about to speak, then hesitated, a flicker of something akin to vulnerability crossing his features. He looked away, towards the rain-streaked window, his gaze distant and unfocused. "I built this program," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Brick by brick. And then you walked in with your raw talent, your unconventional methods, and suddenly everything I'd worked for felt threatened." The admission hung in the air, fragile and exposed. Darius saw a glimpse of the man behind the facade, the insecurity masked by a veneer of control. He saw the fear of being displaced, the desperation to cling to a carefully constructed image of authority. He understood, with a sudden clarity, that Alden's actions weren't solely directed at him, but were a reflection of a deeper, systemic issue. The unspoken hierarchy, the ingrained prejudice that favored the privileged, the fear of change that clung to the hallowed halls of the institution. And he, Darius Cole, the scholarship student from Georgia, had become a symbol of that change. He looked at Alden, at the lines etched around his eyes, the weariness that seemed to seep from his very pores. He saw not just an adversary, but a man grappling with his own demons, a man trapped in a system that rewarded conformity and punished those who dared to challenge the status quo. And in that moment, the anger began to dissipate, replaced by a strange sense of empathy. "I'm not here to threaten anyone's position, Professor," Darius said quietly. "I'm just here to learn." The rain outside had softened to a drizzle, the drumming against the windows, now a gentle murmur. The silence that followed was no longer heavy with tension, but with a quiet understanding. A shift had occurred, a subtle realignment of power. The room felt different, the air lighter. The rain had washed away more than just the grime from the window panes. It had cleansed the air between them, revealing the vulnerability beneath the carefully constructed facades. The chill of the Cambridge autumn had given way to a brittle winter, the air sharp enough to bite at exposed skin. Darius remembered that first, overwhelming wave of cold, how it had mirrored the icy knot in his stomach as he'd stepped off the plane from Georgia, a scholarship student in a land of towering intellects. That Darius felt like a ghost now, a wisp of memory barely tethered to the present. The library's hushed reverence, once a source of intimidation, now felt like a familiar embrace. He ran a hand over the worn spine of a textbook, the Greek symbols no longer a daunting cipher, but a language whispered between him and the universe. Had it really only been a year? A year since Professor Alden's piercing gaze had dissected him, measured him, weighed his worth against the glittering backdrop of Cambridge's legacy? He could almost feel the phantom pressure of that scrutiny, a weight on his chest that he realized, with a strange detachment, was gone. The weeks that followed that initial encounter with Alden had been a blur of late nights fueled by lukewarm coffee and the relentless pursuit of understanding. Every problem Alden set, every subtly barbed question in class, had become a personal challenge. Darius recalled the sting of those first few tutorials, the way his carefully constructed arguments seemed to crumble under Alden's probing. He remembered the flush of shame creeping up his neck, the way his voice would falter. He thinks I'm not good enough. He thinks I don't belong here. The thought had been a corrosive whisper in his mind, threatening to erode his hard-won confidence. But something else had taken root, a quiet defiance that bloomed in the solitude of his late-night studies. He wouldn't let Alden's doubts define him. He wouldn't let the whispers win. He'd started small, meticulously dissecting every lecture, every assigned reading, searching for the underlying logic, the elegant architecture of mathematics. Evan, his roommate, a lanky, perpetually cheerful Californian, would sometimes find him hunched over his desk at 3 a.m., illuminated by the pale glow of his desk lamp, muttering equations under his breath. "Dude, you're going to burn out," Evan would warn, his voice thick with sleep. Darius would just offer a tired smile and push the coffee cup closer. He hadn't been able to explain the burning need to prove himself, not even to Evan, who understood the pressure cooker of Cambridge better than most. It wasn't just about the grades or even about proving Alden wrong. It was about validating the sacrifices his family had made, the unwavering belief they had in him. It was about proving to himself that he belonged, that he had earned his place amongst the brightest minds in the world. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to turn. His solutions to Alden's increasingly complex problems became more elegant, more insightful. The faltering hesitation in his voice during tutorials was replaced by a quiet confidence. He started to see a flicker of something in Alden's eyes, a grudging acknowledgement, perhaps even a hint of respect. The change wasn't dramatic, more like the subtle shift in the air before a storm breaks. One afternoon, after Darius had presented a particularly innovative solution to a notoriously difficult problem, Alden had paused, a rare, thoughtful expression on his face. "That's unexpected, Mr. Cole," he'd said, his voice devoid of its usual edge. Darius had simply nodded, his heart hammering against his ribs, a strange mix of triumph and exhaustion washing over him. Winter melted into spring, and the spring blossomed into summer. The academic year culminated in the final honors presentations, a showcase of the best undergraduate research. Darius stood backstage, clutching his notes, the hushed murmur of the audience filtering through the heavy curtains. He could feel the familiar flutter of nerves, but this time it was different. It wasn't the crippling anxiety of that first semester, but the electric hum of anticipation. He'd poured months of work into his research, pushing the boundaries of his understanding, exploring the intricate dance of numbers with a single-minded focus. He took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The spotlight felt warm on his face, and he looked out at the sea of faces. He saw Evan grinning at him from the front row, giving him a thumbs up. He saw Alden, his expression unreadable, sitting amongst the other faculty members. He began to speak, his voice clear and steady, the complex equations flowing effortlessly. He explained his research, the intricacies of his findings, the implications for future study. He spoke not just with knowledge, but with passion, the quiet fire of his dedication illuminating his words. As he concluded his presentation, a profound silence descended upon the auditorium. For a heartbeat, the only sound was his own breathing. Then a single pair of hands began to clap, then another and another, until the silence erupted into a thunderous applause, a wave of sound that washed over him, engulfing him in its warmth. He stood there, bathed in the light, a faint smile playing on his lips. The knot in his stomach was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet sense of accomplishment. He had done it. He had proven himself. He belonged. The journey had been arduous, the climb steep, but he had reached the summit. And as he looked out at the applauding crowd, he knew that this was just the beginning. The muted click of the latch echoed in the otherwise silent room. Darius stood for a moment, the weight of his graduation gown still settling on his shoulders, the faint scent of old wood and mothballs clinging to its heavy fabric. It was over. For years, a lifetime compressed into a relentless cycle of theorems, proofs, and the quiet hum of late-night study sessions had culminated in this moment. He shrugged off the gown, the soft thud against the worn carpet a strangely anticlimactic sound. It felt less like triumph and more like shedding a skin, the familiar weight replaced by a strange, echoing hollowness. He turned to face Evan, his roommate, his confidant, the silent witness to the internal battles fought within these walls. Evan leaned against the window frame, the afternoon sun painting a halo around his tousled hair, a knowing smile playing on his lips. For years, and the room still held the echoes of their shared laughter, their whispered anxieties, the low murmur of shared dreams. The cheap plywood desk, scarred with the remnants of countless equations, the faded posters clinging precariously to the walls, even the persistent drip of the leaky faucet, all held the indelible mark of their shared journey. "You're a legend, man," Evans said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. Darius managed a weak smile. Legend. The word felt alien, ill-fitting. He remembered the gnawing uncertainty of his first days at the Institute, the subtle barbs of Professor Alden, the whispers in the hallways that questioned his place, a scholarship student from a small town in Georgia, daring to share space with the intellectual elite. He remembered the suffocating pressure to prove himself, to silence the doubts, both internal and external. He saw a flicker of that same doubt in his reflection in the window pane, a ghost he thought he'd exorcised. "I'm just getting started," Darius replied, the words a quiet affirmation, a promise whispered not just to Evan, but to the lingering vestiges of that insecure freshman who'd once stood trembling before the daunting gates of the Institute. Evan pushed himself off the window frame, crossing the room to clasp Darius on the shoulder. "Don't sell yourself short, Cole. You weathered Alden's storm. You carved your own path. That takes more than just brilliance. It takes guts." Alden. The name still held a certain weight, a reminder of the subtle, almost imperceptible, ways in which prejudice could manifest. The seemingly innocuous questions designed to expose a perceived inadequacy, the assignments that pushed the boundaries of what was expected, the almost palpable skepticism that clung to every interaction. Darius had initially interpreted it as a challenge, a test of his mettle. But as the months turned into years, he began to recognize a more insidious undercurrent, a quiet disdain for those who dared to challenge the established order, who dared to dream beyond the confines of their perceived limitations. He remembered the day he finally confronted Alden, not with anger or resentment, but with the quiet confidence born of hard-won knowledge and unwavering self-belief. He'd presented his thesis, a complex, groundbreaking exploration of a mathematical concept Alden himself had dismissed as unprovable. The silence in the room that followed his presentation had been deafening, broken only by the rhythmic tap of Alden's pen against his desk, a sound that resonated with a mixture of grudging admiration and simmering resentment. That moment, Darius realized, was more than just an academic triumph. It was a victory over the invisible walls of prejudice and preconceived notions. He looked around the small, cluttered room, a wave of unexpected nostalgia washing over him. This space, once a symbol of his isolation, had become a sanctuary, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He remembered the countless nights spent hunched over his desk, fueled by cheap coffee and unwavering determination. The quiet hum of Evan's late-night coding sessions a constant backdrop to his own intellectual struggles. He remembered the shared triumphs, the commiserations over setbacks, the quiet conversations that stretched late into the night, weaving a tapestry of shared dreams and aspirations. "It wasn't just me," Darius said, his voice barely a whisper. "We did it. Together." Evan's answering smile was a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken bond they'd forged, a bond tempered in the crucible of shared experiences and mutual support. As the last rays of the setting sun painted the room in hues of orange and gold, Darius felt a sense of quiet peace settle over him. He knew the road ahead would be filled with new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But he also knew that he carried within him the unwavering conviction that he was worthy, that he belonged, that his voice, no matter how quiet, deserved to be heard. The journey from a small town in Georgia to the hallowed halls of the Cambridge Institute had been more than just an academic pursuit. It had been a journey of self-discovery, a testament to the transformative power of self-belief. And as he stepped out of the familiar confines of his dorm room, he carried with him not just the weight of his degree, but the weight of a newfound confidence, a quiet assurance that he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He was ready to make his mark on the world. The world, after all, was just a larger equation waiting to be solved.